I never believed in time travel. Not really. Sure, I'd watched the movies, read the books, entertained the possibilities during late-night conversations with friends who believed in everything from alien abductions to government conspiracies. But deep down, in that place where skepticism lives and breathes, I dismissed it all as fantasy, science fiction, the desperate imaginings of minds unwilling to accept the linear nature of existence. I was wrong, so catastrophically, life-alteringly wrong, that even now, months after returning, I find myself questioning not just what I experienced, but the very nature of reality itself. Because I didn't just travel back in time, I witnessed the moment that changed everything, the fall, the moment innocence died and humanity began its long, agonizing march toward the world we know today. And God help me, I can't unsee what I saw. It started, as most extraordinary things do, in the most ordinary of ways. I was cleaning out my late grandfather's attic, a task I'd been putting off for months since his passing. The old house smelled of dust and memories, each box a portal to decades I'd never lived but somehow recognized through family stories and faded photographs. My grandfather had been an archaeologist, a man obsessed with ancient civilizations and lost histories. His study was a maze of artifacts, books in languages I couldn't pronounce, and journals filled with theories that made my rational mind recoil. Among his possessions, tucked away in a corner beneath moth-eaten blankets, I found it. A stone tablet, no larger than a dinner plate, covered in symbols that seemed to shift and dance when I wasn't looking directly at them. The stone felt warm to the touch, almost alive, pulsing with an energy that made my fingertips tingle and my heart race. According to his notes, which I found scattered around it like prayer offerings, he believed this tablet was a fragment of something far older and more significant than anything he'd ever encountered. He called it a, quote, temporal anchor, though his handwriting grew increasingly erratic as his theories became more desperate, more impossible to believe. The first time I touched the tablet with both hands, the world shifted. Not dramatically, not like the explosive flash of light you see in movies. It was subtler, more profound. The air grew thick, almost viscous, and I felt a pulling sensation deep in my chest, as if invisible hands were drawing me forward through layers of reality I'd never known existed. The attic around me began to fade, not disappearing so much as becoming translucent, like watercolors bleeding into each other. And then, without warning, without preparation, I was falling through time itself. The sensation was indescribable. Imagine drowning in liquid starlight while every moment that had ever been or would be whispered secrets in your ear. I saw empires rise and fall in heartbeats, watched the birth and death of stars like flickering candles, felt the weight of eternity pressing against my consciousness until I thought I would shatter from the sheer immensity of it all. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I found myself standing on solid ground, gasping for air I wasn't sure I needed, staring at a world that was familiar, yet utterly alien. The first thing that struck me was the silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of a deeper quiet, the kind of profound stillness that exists before the first word is spoken, or the first sin committed. The air itself felt different, cleaner, somehow more substantial, as if every breath contained the essence of life itself. I stood at the edge of what I can only describe as paradise, though that word seems inadequate, almost insulting in its simplicity. Before me stretched a garden that defied every natural law I understood. Trees bore fruit in impossible combinations, their leaves shimmering with colors that had no names, their branches reaching toward a sky that was somehow both familiar and completely alien. Flowers bloomed in patterns that followed mathematical principles beyond human comprehension, their fragrances creating symphonies of scent that made my soul weep with joy. Rivers flowed upward in places, defying gravity with the casual ease of pure intention, their waters crystal clear and singing, literally singing, with voices that harmonized in frequencies that resonated in my bones. And the light, dear God, the light. It wasn't the harsh, angular illumination of our sun, but something softer, more intimate, as if the very air was infused with divine presence. It came from everywhere and nowhere, casting no shadows, yet revealing every detail with perfect clarity. As I stood there, overwhelmed by the impossible beauty of it all, I heard them before I saw them. Laughter. Pure, unfiltered joy bubbling up from souls that had never known pain, never experienced loss, never felt the crushing weight of shame or regret. The sound drew me deeper into the garden, my feet moving of their own accord along paths that seemed to form themselves beneath my steps. And then I saw them, Adam and Eve, though calling them by those names feels almost sacrilegious now, like reducing symphonies to single notes. They were more beautiful than any human I had ever seen, yet somehow I knew instantly that they were the first, the template from which all of us would be imperfectly copied. Their beauty wasn't just physical, though their forms were perfect in ways that made classical sculptures look like crude sketches. It radiated from within, a luminescence that had nothing to do with light and everything to do with the absence of corruption. They moved through the garden with the easy grace of beings perfectly at home in their world, their every gesture an act of worship, their every breath a prayer of gratitude. I watched them for hours that felt like days, hidden among trees that seemed to welcome my presence, while keeping me invisible to their innocent eyes. They spoke to each other in a language that was music, their words creating visible harmonies in the air between them. They named the animals with voices that carved identity into existence itself, each creature springing to life at the sound of their true name. Lions lay down with lambs not as some future promise, but as the natural order of a world that had never known predator and prey. Bears shared honey with foxes, eagles soared alongside butterflies, and every living thing moved in perfect harmony with every other. This wasn't just peace. It was the very definition of how life was meant to be, the original blueprint before everything went catastrophically wrong. And I was witnessing it all, an intruder in paradise, a corrupted being observing purity through eyes that had already seen too much. Then I saw him, or perhaps felt him would be more accurate, because the moment of his arrival was less visual than experiential. The garden itself seemed to hold its breath, every leaf and petal turning toward a presence that commanded attention without demanding it. He walked among them as naturally as the wind moves through grass, his form both magnificent and humble, terrible and gentle, as if all contradictions found their resolution in him. When he spoke to them, his voice was like the first word ever spoken and the last word that would ever need to be said. They responded to him with such natural intimacy, such unconscious love, that I felt like a voyeur witnessing the most sacred relationship imaginable. This was communion as it was meant to be, creator and created in perfect fellowship, walking together in the cool of the day, sharing thoughts and dreams and the simple joy of existence. I watched him show them wonders that made the garden's previous miracles seem ordinary, flowers that bloomed at his touch into forms that existed only in his imagination, streams that flowed in spirals through the air at his gesture, light that danced between his fingers like living poetry. But even in that perfect moment, I knew what was coming. The knowledge sat in my stomach like lead, the terrible burden of foresight in a place where only present joy should exist. I had read the story, heard it in Sunday school, debated its meaning in philosophy classes, but knowing the ending of a tale is different from watching it unfold in real time, seeing the actual faces, hearing the actual voices of those whose choice would condemn every soul that came after them. I found myself wanting to shout warnings, to somehow change what I knew was inevitable, but the weight of predestination pressed down on me like a mountain. This had happened. This would happen. This was happening. Regardless of my presence, regardless of my horror, regardless of my desperate desire to somehow undo what could not be undone. The serpent arrived on a Tuesday. I don't know how I knew it was Tuesday. Time seemed to flow differently in Eden, measured not by the rotation of celestial bodies, but by the rhythm of divine breath. But somehow, in that moment, I felt the weight of weekdays and mortality pressing against the timeless perfection of paradise. It didn't slither in with dramatic fanfare or announce itself with ominous music. Instead, it simply was. Suddenly present in the garden as if it had always been there, coiled around the trunk of a tree that I somehow knew, with bone-deep certainty, I was not supposed to notice. This was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Though standing in its presence, I understood that even that name was inadequate. It wasn't just a tree, it was a choice made manifest, a question posed in bark and leaves and forbidden fruit. The serpent was beautiful in the way that perfect lies are beautiful, its scales catching light that seemed to come from within, its eyes holding depths that promised answers to questions that hadn't yet been asked. When it spoke, its voice was like silk wrapped around razors, each word carefully chosen to sound like wisdom while concealing the poison beneath. Eve approached the tree with the casual innocence of someone who had never encountered deception, someone for whom the concept of lies was as foreign as the concept of death. I wanted to scream, to throw myself between her and the serpent, to somehow prevent what I knew was about to unfold. But I was paralyzed, not by fear, but by the terrible understanding that I was watching the hinge point of all human history. Every war, every tear, every moment of suffering that had ever existed or would exist hung in the balance of this single conversation between a perfect woman and a creature that embodied the very concept of corruption. The serpent spoke to her of enlightenment, of becoming like God, of the vast knowledge that lay just one bite away. Its words painted pictures of wisdom and power, of eyes open to realities beyond her current understanding. And she listened with the trusting attention of someone who had never been lied to, someone whose world contained no framework for understanding manipulation or deceit. The moment she took the fruit, the garden screamed. Not audibly. The sound was too deep for ears, too fundamental for simple hearing. It was the sound of reality tearing, of perfection suddenly discovering its own fragility, of innocence dying in real time. The fruit itself seemed ordinary, disappointing even given the magnitude of its consequences. But as her teeth broke its skin, I felt the universe shudder. Light dimmed, though the sun hadn't moved. Colors became somehow less vibrant, as if a filter had been placed over existence itself. The very air grew heavier, charged with new possibilities that all led toward death. When she offered the fruit to Adam, his acceptance carried a weight that nearly drove me to my knees. This wasn't simple disobedience. This was the moment when choice became consequence, when action became destiny, when two perfect beings traded eternal life for the terrible burden of moral knowledge. The change was immediate and devastating. I watched awareness flood their faces like a tsunami of unwanted understanding. Their eyes opened just as the serpent had promised, but what they saw first was their own nakedness. Not just physical, but spiritual, emotional, existential. For the first time, they felt shame, that crushing realization of exposure and inadequacy that would become the inheritance of every human soul born after them. They covered themselves with leaves, their movements frantic and desperate, trying to hide not just their bodies, but their newly awakened sense of inadequacy. The garden around them began to respond to their fallen state. Thorns appeared on roses. Fruit became scarce on certain trees. The very ground seemed to harden beneath their feet. Paradise was slipping away in real time, not because God was punishing it, but because it could no longer sustain beings who had chosen mortality over eternal life. When God came walking in the garden that evening, his approach was different than before. Where once there had been anticipation and joy, now there was a grief so profound it seemed to echo from the foundations of creation itself. Adam and Eve hid from him among the trees, their first experience of fear adding another layer to their rapidly accumulating catalog of new emotions. When he called to them, his voice carried a sorrow that made me weep tears I didn't know I was capable of crying. This wasn't the voice of an angry deity seeking to punish disobedient children. This was the voice of a father watching his beloved choose death over life, separation over communion, knowledge over trust. The conversation that followed was heartbreaking in its inevitability. Adam's attempt to shift blame, first to Eve, then implicitly to God himself, revealed how quickly innocence could be replaced by self-preservation. Eve's simple honesty about being deceived showed that some part of her original nature remained, but even that was now tainted by the knowledge of her mistake. The pronouncement of consequences that followed wasn't a divine temper tantrum or arbitrary punishment. It was simply the natural result of their choice, the inevitable outcome of trading perfection for imperfection, immortality for mortality, innocence for experience. When God spoke of pain in childbearing, of thorns and thistles, of death and separation, he wasn't creating new forms of suffering. He was describing what already existed the moment they chose to eat from the tree. The ground would resist them because they were no longer in perfect harmony with creation. Death would claim them because they were no longer sustained by the tree of life. Pain would mark their existence because they had chosen the path of experience over the path of trust. And through it all, I heard something in his voice that I hadn't expected. Promise. Even as he described the consequences of their choice, he spoke of a future victory, a coming redemption, a way back to what had been lost. The expulsion from Eden was simultaneously the most devastating and most merciful act one have ever witnessed. As God clothed them with garments of skin, their first experience of wearing death to cover their shame, I understood that he was protecting them from something even worse than mortality. If they had eaten from the tree of life in their fallen state, they would have been locked forever in their corruption, unable to die, and thus unable to be redeemed. The angel with the flaming sword that barred their return wasn't just keeping them out, it was keeping hope alive, ensuring that their exile remained temporary rather than eternal. As they walked away from paradise, hand in hand but forever changed, I saw in their posture the first glimpse of the resilience that would define their descendants. They were no longer perfect, but they were still capable of love, still capable of growth, still carrying within them the image of their Creator, even if that image was now fractured and incomplete. The journey back through time was even more traumatic than the journey to Eden. I felt every war, every plague, every moment of human suffering passing through me like bullets of pure anguish. The weight of knowing how it all began, of seeing the exact moment when everything went wrong, pressed down on me until I thought my mind would snap under the pressure. When I finally materialized back in my grandfather's attic, gasping and shaking, the stone tablet crumbled to dust in my hands as if it had expended its final purpose. I sat there for hours trying to process what I had experienced, trying to understand how to live with the knowledge of what I had witnessed. The modern world around me seemed simultaneously more precious and more tragic than before. Every act of kindness was a miracle, a glimpse of Eden breaking through the corruption. Every moment of suffering was a reminder of the price we all pay for that first, fatal choice. I understand now why my grandfather's notes had become increasingly desperate. How do you carry the weight of witnessing the moment everything changed? How do you live in a fallen world when you've seen what perfection looks like? How do you explain to others that paradise wasn't just a story, but a place you've actually walked, air you've actually breathed, a reality you've actually experienced? The knowledge haunts me, yes, but it also fills me with a strange, unshakable hope, because I didn't just see the fall, I saw the promise that followed. I heard in God's voice the certainty of redemption, the guarantee that this brokenness is temporary, that the story that began with choice and consequence will end with restoration and victory. We live in the space between Eden and the promise, between the paradise lost and the paradise regained. And somehow, knowing that, seeing the whole arc of the story from its devastating beginning to its guaranteed conclusion, makes even the darkest moments of human existence bearable, because I know how the story ends. I've heard it in the voice of God himself. We're going home.